In 1942, deep in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, American troops received a chilling directive that defied all logic. If you spot an Australian soldier's rucksack abandoned on the ground, turn around and leave it alone. No questions. No exceptions. And under no circumstances should you ever touch it. They were dubbed the Phantom Diggers by their allies, men who reeked of decay, hadn't seen soap in months, and could melt into the undergrowth like smoke. But one bold U.S. sergeant, fresh from the beaches of Guadalcanal, dismissed it as campfire folklore. He eyed that tattered canvas bag, half buried in mud, and figured, what's the harm in a quick peek? What he uncovered wasn't rations or maps. It was irrefutable evidence that these fighters had shed their humanity long ago, evolving into predators the Japanese Imperial Army dreaded more than naval bombardments. Today, we're uncovering the forgotten saga of Australia's jungle specters in World War II. And believe me, the facts eclipse any tall tale you've heard. The C-47 transport plane shuddered to a halt on a makeshift airstrip carved from the emerald hell of Papua New Guinea, its propellers whipping up a storm of red clay and vine fragments that tasted like iron and rot. It was mid-1942. Major Elias Hawthorne of U.S. Army Intelligence disembarked into Australian-held territory for what was supposed to be a routine liaison mission. That single step fractured his world into before and after. He'd pored over encrypted cables, analyzed troop movements, and memorized dossiers marked "Eyes Only." Yet nothing in those pages braced him for the raw truth awaiting at the forward base in the Owen Stanley Range. The humidity wasn't mere weather. It was a living entity, clinging like a second skin you couldn't shed. But the assault on his senses began not with the heat or the drone of insects, but with an odor that slithered into his lungs, primal and utterly alien, stirring an urge to flee. From the treeline emerged a patrol of 6 men, and Hawthorne's breath caught. They bore no badges of rank. Their khaki fatigues had faded to ghostly shreds, smeared with earth tones that blurred them against the foliage, their faces streaked in mud and grease paint that rendered them otherworldly. One hefted a rucksack that appeared scavenged from a battlefield grave, swollen and stained as if it had soaked in every monsoon puddle across the Pacific. This spectacle clashed so fiercely with American military precision that Hawthorne, driven by instinct, moved to assist the burdened soldier. It was an error that could have ended his tour, and maybe more, because in an instant, his wrist was seized in the vice-like hold of an Australian warrant officer. That grip was merely the opening lesson in a revelation that would append Hawthorne's every assumption about warfare. Sergeant Ronan Hale, a battle-hardened veteran whose exploits filled shadowed ledgers never meant for public eyes, fixed the American with a stare devoid of warmth, only a steely void. His words landed not as counsel but as an unyielding decree, his tone low and laced with finality that amplified its menace. Hale cautioned never to handle their gear under any pretext. He revealed that those rucksacks cradled not mere supplies, but peril incarnate, bundled in weathered fabric. Hawthorne couldn't yet grasp that this admonition was the gateway to truths dismantling his West Point-honed doctrines. He puzzled over why these elite troops, the vanguard of the Allied push, resembled vagrants from Darwin's back alleys. The explanation rooted not in lax standards but in the raw science of survival and instincts honed over millennia, realms high command shunned. These men's arsenal extended beyond rifles and grenades. Their primary tool was scent itself, a notion that struck U.S. officers as preposterous in 1941, when America poured fortunes into equipping GIs with top-grade hygiene kits, canned provisions, and morale boosters. A groomed fighter, they reasoned, was a sharp one, upholding cleanliness even amid the tropics. But the Australians intuited a truth U.S. logistics couldn't quantify. The jungle punishes intruders, and anyone carrying the whiff of the outside world becomes prey, a flare in the dark for ambush. A standard American GI's daily intake betrayed him from afar: tinned spam, corned beef, Hershey bars, Lucky Strikes rolled in Virginia leaf. He scrubbed with scented bars, splashed cologne to cling to normalcy, laundered gear with stateside soap. This brew of aromas screamed "foreigner" in an ecosystem attuned to subtlety, alerting Japanese scouts well before boot falls echoed. It spelled doom in close-quarters combat. The Australians countered with extremes that left allies reeling, morphing into olfactory phantoms. Days before deep patrols, Commandos of the 22nd Independent Company initiated a regimen that turned stomachs. They ceased all bathing, ditching soaps, pastes, and razors, letting grime and microbes weave a natural shield. Diets shifted to mimic local tribes and enemy rations. Yams, sago, wild fruits, salted pork scavenged from villages. The crown jewel? Nuoc Mam's counterpart, fermented shrimp paste, a staple in Pacific Isles, with a pungency evoking spoiled tides. They didn't just consume it. They immersed in its essence until their pores exhaled the same notes as any islander or imperial infantryman. Gear followed suit: boots, webbing, packs steeped in mud, sweat, and paste, indistinguishable from decaying fronds. American advances hushed the wild, birds scattered, possums chattered alarms. But Australians glided through unchanged, the bush embracing them as kin. They closed on foes undetected, striking from shadows. That reek, which nearly felled Hawthorne at base, preserved countless lives, enabling ambushes where odds favored extinction. Yet scent was but the surface. Those forbidden rucksacks concealed doctrines alien to U.S. might, reliant on machines and barrage. Hawthorne marveled at how filth birthed supremacy, but deadlier secrets lurked within. Curiosity's toll? Steep, as one Yank would soon learn. The stench that assaulted Major Hawthorne on that airstrip was no accident, it was engineered perfection. Those rucksacks, the ones no one was allowed to touch, carried more than rotting canvas and fermented paste. They held the physical proof of a doctrine that turned disgust into dominance. And the price of ignoring that doctrine came crashing down on a rainy afternoon in late 1942, just outside the perimeter of a forward supply dump near Kokoda. A young American corporal named Daniel Reese, part of a newly arrived reinforcement platoon, had been assigned to help unload crates from a convoy of muddy jeeps. The rain had turned the ground into a slick red soup. Amid the chaos, he spotted an Australian rucksack leaning against a palm trunk, apparently abandoned. No owner in sight. To Reese it looked like forgotten gear, maybe dropped by a careless sentry. He thought he'd do the right thing, pick it up, carry it to the quartermaster tent, maybe earn a nod of thanks. He never got the chance to finish the thought. The moment his fingers closed around the strap, a thin wire, almost invisible against the wet bark, snapped. A muffled crack split the air, sharp and intimate. Not the theatrical boom of a grenade, but the cold snap of a carefully placed explosive charge no bigger than a cigarette tin. The blast was directional, designed to punish rather than kill outright. It tore through Reese's right forearm just above the wrist, shredding muscle and bone in a single vicious instant. He collapsed screaming, blood mixing with rainwater, while the rucksack itself barely moved, its canvas scorched but intact. Men froze. Australians appeared from nowhere, silent until that second, forming a loose cordon around the scene. No one rushed to help the wounded American. No one apologized. The patrol leader who owned the pack simply walked over, checked the rigging with practiced calm, reset the secondary trip mechanism, and shouldered the bag as though nothing had happened. An American medic finally reached Reese, but the damage was done. The corporal would lose most of his hand and never fire a rifle again. Word of the booby-trapped digger packs spread like malaria through every U.S. unit in the sector within 48 hours. From that day forward, American officers issued explicit standing orders. Australian gear is off-limits. Do not approach. Do not assist. Do not touch. That single incident crystallized the growing chasm between allies. The Americans saw reckless barbarism. The Australians saw necessary insurance. To them a rucksack was never just equipment, it was a final line of defense. If a Japanese patrol overran a position and found one, it had to become a weapon. If a curious stranger reached for it, it had to punish. Mercy had no place in the equation. The packs were sacred in the most ruthless sense. Violate them and pay. But the traps were only one layer. Beneath the canvas lay something far more unsettling, trophies that told a story words could never fully capture. Inside those same rucksacks, carefully wrapped in oilskin, rested small collections no American ever expected to see from their own side. A Japanese officer's cap badge, still pinned to a torn strip of field cap. A blood-stained rising sun flag fragment no larger than a handkerchief. A single dog tag taken not as proof of kill but as a private marker. And in some packs, though this was never confirmed in official after-action reports, small bamboo tubes containing slivers of bone or teeth. Not collected for cruelty, but kept as silent witnesses that the man who carried them had crossed a threshold most soldiers never approach. These were not souvenirs of glory. They were proof of proximity, proof that the carrier had been close enough to touch death and walk away. The Australians understood something the Japanese, and increasingly the Americans, could never fully accept. In the jungle, victory belongs to whoever can endure the longest, wait the longest, become the most invisible. And endurance required more than willpower. It required deliberate surrender of everything that made a man feel civilized. Patrols routinely lasted 21 to 30 days with no resupply. No hot meals. No letters from home. No change of clothes. They moved at a pace measured in yards per hour, not miles. They learned to sleep sitting upright against a tree, head tilted just enough to keep one ear open to the night. They ate what the jungle and the enemy provided, roots dug with bayonets, grubs split open and swallowed raw, captured Japanese rice balls when luck allowed. Water came from vines sliced at dawn or from rainwater collected in ponchos, if the poncho hadn't already been used to wrap a wounded mate. But the deepest transformation happened in the mind. After 10 days without speaking above a whisper, voices began to feel unnatural. Men communicated with hand signals so subtle that even their own shadows seemed to understand them. After 15 days, hunger sharpened into something almost pleasant, a clean, focused burn that drowned out every other distraction. After 20 days, the line between man and environment blurred until the jungle itself felt like an extension of their nervous system. A snapped twig 10 yards away registered not as sound but as pain in the chest. A shift in wind carried not just scent but intent. This was the state the Japanese began to dread most. Imperial troops were disciplined, courageous, often fanatical, but they still operated as soldiers. The Australians, by contrast, had become hunters who no longer thought like soldiers at all. They did not seek contact. They allowed contact to find them. They did not charge bunkers. They waited until the occupants stepped outside to relieve themselves, then struck. They did not call in artillery barrages. They crawled within knife range and waited for the perfect heartbeat of vulnerability. One documented action near Buna in December 1942 illustrates this shift better than any after-action report. A 5-man section from the 26th Independent Company had been shadowing a Japanese supply column for 9 days. They matched pace exactly, staying just outside visual range, living off what the column discarded: empty tins, banana peels, even cigarette but still warm. On the 10th night, the Japanese halted to establish a night perimeter. Sentries were posted. Cooking fires lit. The Australians waited. At 3:17, when the moon dipped behind cloud and the sentries' eyes had adjusted to the glow of embers, the Australians moved. No grenades. No automatic fire. Only bayonets and garrotes. They took the sentries first, silent, surgical. Then the sleeping men around the fires. In under 4 minutes the entire 23-man detachment was neutralized. Not a single shot fired. Not a single alarm raised. The Australians collected maps, codebooks, and a dispatch case containing orders for the next push toward the coast. Then they vanished. When dawn broke, the Japanese relief column found their comrades arranged in a rough circle around the cold fire. Each man's throat opened with clinical precision. Each face turned skyward as though studying the canopy one last time. No looting. No mutilation. Just silence and arrangement. The message was unmistakable. We were here. We were inside your lines. We left when we chose to leave. Sleep will never feel safe again. Word of these silent killings spread through Japanese ranks faster than any official intelligence bulletin. Officers began doubling sentries, then tripling them. Men refused night duty. Patrols moved slower, weapons always at the ready, eyes scanning every shadow. The psychological toll was measurable. Combat fatigue cases among forward Japanese units rose sharply in sectors where Australian independence operated. Men reported nightmares of green ghosts rising from the earth. Some refused to enter thick jungle at all, preferring exposed trails where aircraft could at least see them die. The Australians paid their own price for this mastery, though. Bodies came apart slowly. Tropical ulcers ate through shins until bone showed white against black flesh. Malaria struck in cycles that left men shivering in hammocks one day and marching the next. Dengue fever turned joints to fire. Fungal infections colonized every fold of skin. Yet the most severe damage was invisible. Men returned from patrols with eyes that no longer focused on anything close. They flinched at sudden laughter. Loud voices made their hands curl into fists. Some never spoke above a whisper for months after extraction. Others never spoke at all. Major Hawthorne witnessed one such return on his final week in theater. A patrol staggered in after 27 days. 5 men who had left 31 days earlier as fit commandos. What arrived looked like something dredged from a riverbed. Uniforms hung in tatters fused to skin by dried blood and sap. One man's left boot had rotted through. The foot inside was gray and peeling in wet sheets. Another carried his rifle in both hands like an offering, barrel pointed down, finger permanently locked outside the trigger guard. Their eyes were open but vacant, pupils huge, as though the jungle had stolen the ability to blink. The medical officer who examined them later wrote in a private letter that has since surfaced in archives, "These are not men who have survived the jungle. These are men the jungle has used and then returned when it finished with them." And yet those same men had delivered intelligence that reshaped the entire WWII campaign. They had mapped enemy strongpoints no aerial photograph could reveal. They had intercepted orders that allowed Allied commanders to preempt major counterattacks. They had cost the Japanese far more in morale than in bodies. In sectors they patrolled, the Imperial Army began to hesitate. And hesitation in jungle warfare is death. The rucksacks those returning phantoms carried still held their secrets. The traps, the trophies, the folded maps stained with sweat and insect repellent. No American dared touch them now. Not after what they had seen. Not after what they had begun to understand. The ghosts of the Owen Stanley Range were not born in training camps or on parade grounds. They were forged in darkness, in hunger, in deliberate surrender to everything the civilized world calls weakness. And once forged, they could not be unmade. Not even by victory. The cost of becoming the jungle's perfect predator was never tallied in medals or promotion lists. It was written in the slow unraveling of men who had pushed their bodies and minds past every boundary nature ever intended. Major Hawthorne saw the final piece of that equation unfold during his last days at the Owen Stanley Forward Base, when the war's invisible ledger finally demanded payment. A patrol of 8 men from the 27th Independent Company had been inserted by Catalina flying boat into a coastal mangrove swamp north of Gunna on November 18, 1942. Their mission was simple on paper: locate and disrupt the main Japanese resupply route feeding the beachhead. What the orders did not mention was the reality of operating in a place where land, water, and air seemed to conspire against human life. For 19 days they disappeared. Radio silence was absolute. Then, on the morning of December 7th, 7 shapes emerged from the treeline. 7. Not 8. They moved with the mechanical stiffness of marionettes whose strings had been cut and retied by someone who did not understand anatomy. Their fatigues were no longer cloth. They were a living crust of salt, mud, mangrove sap, and what looked like dried blood that had never quite washed away. One man's left arm hung at an unnatural angle, supported only by a makeshift sling fashioned from rifle slings and vines. Another's face was half hidden beneath a swelling that had turned his left eye into a narrow slit leaking yellow fluid. The smell that rolled ahead of them was no longer merely unpleasant. It was the smell of a tide pool left to rot under the sun for weeks. The medical officer who met them at the edge of the airstrip later wrote in his field diary, "I have seen trench foot, gangrene, blackwater fever. This was different." These men had become the disease itself, and somehow kept walking. The missing 8th man had not been killed by the enemy. He had drowned in his own sweat and fever on the 14th day, slipping quietly beneath black water while the others held position in chest-deep muck. They could not bury him. The ground was liquid. So they carried what remained, his webbing, his rifle, his identity discs, because leaving any part of him behind would have been to admit the jungle had won completely. That small bundle was now lashed to the outside of the patrol leader's rucksack, wrapped in oilskin, another sacred object no one would ever be permitted to touch. Yet even in that state of near collapse, the patrol had achieved what entire battalions could not. They had mapped the exact route of a major Japanese barge convoy, timed the guard rotations at 3 hidden landing points, identified the camouflaged fuel dumps, and, most critically, intercepted a sealed dispatch case containing the Japanese plan for a final counterthrust toward Port Moresby. The intelligence they delivered shifted the entire Bunagana campaign. Allied commanders finally understood where the next hammer would fall. Airstrikes were redirected. Artillery was repositioned. The Japanese advance stalled, then fractured. But the numbers that mattered most were never entered into any official report. In the sectors patrolled by these independent companies, Japanese night patrols virtually ceased. Enemy sentries began firing at shadows. Officers found men asleep at their posts with bayonets clutched in both hands. Rumors spread through imperial ranks of white-skinned oni, demons, who rose from the mud, took what they wanted, and vanished without sound or trace. Some units started burning their dead rather than risk leaving bodies that could be used as bait or markers. Others refused to move after sunset at all. The jungle, once their greatest ally against the mechanized Americans, had become a place of constant dread. The Australians had not beaten the Japanese with superior weapons or numbers. They had beaten them by removing the one comfort every soldier clings to, the illusion of safety. They made the enemy feel hunted in the place where he was supposed to be the hunter. And that feeling, more than bullets or bombs, broke units faster than any field hospital could count. Hawthorne spent his final evening speaking quietly with a patrol sergeant who had first seized his wrist weeks earlier. The man's name was never written down in any American log, he was simply the sergeant. Under the hiss of a pressure lamp, Hawthorne asked the question that had been burning inside him since the first day. Why go this far? Why become this? The sergeant looked at him for a long moment, eyes reflecting the flame like polished obsidian. Then he answered in a voice so soft it barely carried over the insects. Because the Japanese are very good at dying for their emperor. We had to become better at making them die. That's all. He paused, then added something that Hawthorne would carry for the rest of his life. We didn't choose to stop being men. The jungle chose for us. Once you accept that, everything else becomes simple. The next morning Hawthorne boarded the C-47 back to Port Moresby. As the plane lifted off, he looked down at the green ocean that swallowed the Owen Stanley Range. Somewhere beneath that canopy were men who no longer belonged to any army in the conventional sense. They belonged to the terrain itself, extensions of vines, mud, silence, and patience sharpened into a blade. They won battles that larger forces could only dream of winning. They delivered intelligence that saved thousands of Allied lives. They forced an enemy who believed himself invincible in jungle warfare to hesitate, to doubt, to fear. And they paid for every yard of that advantage with pieces of themselves that could never be replaced. Decades later, military historians would puzzle over the statistics. How could a few hundred commandos from a nation of barely 7 million produce kill ratios and intelligence yields that rivaled entire divisions? The answer was never in the training manuals or the equipment lists. It was in the deliberate choice to discard comfort, hygiene, mercy, and even humanity when the moment demanded it. The Australians did not fight the war the way they wanted to fight it. They fought the war the jungle required. And in doing so, they became something the Japanese, and even their American allies, could never fully comprehend. Major Elias Hawthorne retired in 1958 after a quiet career teaching military history at a small college in Virginia. On his desk, beside faded photographs and yellowing maps, sat a single object he had carried home from New Guinea. It was not a medal. It was not a captured Japanese sword. It was a small, stained Australian Army playing card, the Ace of Spades, given to him by the sergeant on his last night in the Owen Stanleys. The card bore a faint smear in one corner. Blood, mud, rust. Hawthorne never asked. Some marks are better left unexplained. He kept the card until the day he died in 1984. In his final letter to his daughter, he wrote only one sentence about the war. The Americans brought the machines. The Australians brought something machines can never replace. They brought the willingness to become whatever the war demanded. And in the end, that was enough. Beneath the jungles of New Guinea, the ghosts still move. Silent, patient, invisible. They do not rest. They wait. And somewhere, deep in the green, a rucksack sits against a tree. Wired, sacred, untouchable. Do not touch it. The ghosts are watching.